This program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Watch Mojo and the Inside Mojo podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and with me, as usual, is WatchMojo's co-founder and CEO, Ashkan Karbasfrooshan. How's it going today, Ash?
I'm very, very well. It's a bit chilly here in Montreal, but we're feeling really, really good because Ivan Le Grand, Ivan the Great, Ivan Demidov is coming to join the Habs a bit premature. So, my God, I was so excited yesterday when the news broke out, or yesterday or the day before, whenever. I've been on cloud nine ever since.
New player in town, a playoff spot, possibly secured. And spring is around the corner. So all things are looking up.
I know.
So before we get into the subject of today's episode, you might have heard of this thing called tariffs. It seems to be the thing that everybody is talking about lately and freaking out about to some degree. What's your interpretation? What can we expect from tariffs in the way that they would affect, particularly the media landscape and YouTube? Is there any concern?
I mean, any concern? Look, for the last 5 years, actually going back to COVID, there's always been this like massive externality that really has nothing to do with, let's say, WatchMojo, YouTube. But, if somebody sneezes, you may catch a cold. So tariffs are the latest thing. After COVID, we also had interest rates shooting up, which obviously has like an effect across the economy. So tariffs, it's funny because the US, people don't know this, but between 1861 and 1933, the US was actually very much protectionist in terms of their economy. They were isolationist in terms of foreign policy until World War I. And then Woodrow Wilson was like in 1917 was like, we got to get involved. And then the 20th century was all about expansionist foreign policy to control resources, to project power, yada, yada. Economically, they were protectionist, right? And then what happens is to you, since this is ultimately, we talk about startups and tech and all that, let's take one company, Alphabet. So Alphabet, Google, in search, it's dominant. It's got a very closed-minded. It's protectionist. It's not going to open up its source code. It's not going to share advertising data. The same company, Alphabet, when it launched Google Plus, their social platform to rival Facebook, who was the dominant player, they were very open, very laissez-faire. Like, we'll share data because they're a challenger to the incumbent. Right. So similarly, coming out of, World War II, the US kind of wanted to totally take over from the British Empire and push back the USSR. So obviously, as a capitalist beacon or whatever, it kind of dropped all tariffs and it largely adopted a very laissez-faire economic policy, which undoubtedly, along with like American ingenuity and yada, yada, explain America's success in the 20th century. So fast forward to today, I go criticize and praise people, groups, when reasonable criticism, don't be dogmatic about things. Yeah. There's 1,000 things I don't really like about Trump, but there are things about him that I understand his appeal to his voters. So I'm not saying this as like an anti-Trump guy at all, because I called his win in 2016. I said 2024 would be his to lose. So I was right on that front. He doesn't understand, I think, economics. That doesn't mean he's not like savvy or smart. He gets finance. Like I studied finance, but economics is a different branch, But the point is, today, there was a clip of him being like, are the Great Lakes connected? And I was like, Jesus Christ, he's learning geography today. And earlier this week, he was like learning tariffs. So I don't think that, in business especially, there's two kinds of leaders. There are those who surround themselves with a lot of smart people who are experts. And they might still follow their gut and instinct, but it's kind of like a weighted average, feedback that they distill and then come up with a recommendation. And then there are others who are just like fly off the seat of their pants, shoot first, ask later. And if we're going to be objective, Donald Trump is the second. It's not like he sits there and goes read Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, or reads, economic policy, white papers, and then comes out and, he does none of that. So he doesn't really understand American consumers because American consumers, many of them don't even want to work 5 days in an office. They're not going to go work in a stupid plant. Not that there's anything wrong with working in a plant, by the way. And American consumers are sure as hell not going to go buy an iPhone for $3,000. So he doesn't get American consumers because what he's describing is not really even, I think, what most Americans would want to happen once you take them through this situation. But the reason ultimately why he kind of comes out, says something, and then backtracks is because he doesn't understand finance either. What ended up happening is he thought that just because America economically and militarily is this big, massive thing, that it could dictate to others. But what ended up happening is not so much that the stock market crashed and he panicked. It's more that the bond prices reacted a certain way, where his whole bet is to try to create and induce a recession, cool down the economy, to ultimately get the Federal Reserve to bring down interest rates. Now, a cynic would say that's a man with a lot of debt that cares a lot about what the cost of money, interest is. So he's trying to bring that down. But what ended up happening is a lot of foreign holders, creditors of US debt, Japan actually, America's so-called ally, they dumped American bonds thinking this is going to be a shit show. We don't want to hold this. And then interest rates went higher because now America had to give a bigger incentive to people to buy their debt. So that you could spin it all you want, art of the deal, winning. He's a fucktard is all that there is to it. His bet backfired. Just that simple. This was all about bringing interest rates down, but the opposite happened. Interest rates started to go up. So he realized he had to capitulate because the cost of money was going to go up. The stock market was going to continue to go down. And ultimately, tariffs do lead to smaller economies, less employment. So it's unfortunate. Now let's segue.
Yeah.
It doesn't really have an effect on us today. And I actually don't even complain. I mean, I'll make fun of things online because I'm just that kind of guy, maybe. But I can't really complain because, look, it's not like we're sitting on all this inventory or we're like shipping parts from China and now we got to think of warehousing them. It doesn't affect us directly in the near term. But in the long run, it's a bit like when interest rates during the end of ZIRP, zero interest rate phenomenon, when inflation went up, interest rates shot up. So as companies are like, hey, it's more expensive to do things now, eventually they do scale back marketing.
Yeah.
Includes advertising. So that affects everybody. So my gut is that, like many other things that Trump says, it is just a lot of noise and distraction. I don't necessarily think this will get to a place where, but the damage, some of it has already been done, because if you are, if you are a decision maker, you look at America like the crazy, unstable chick that is not going to be consistent and reliable. So that's not good. But again, does it affect us? Not really. Like the broader fundamental trends of AVOD and YouTube and all that doesn't really affect us. But I mean, you could see that it's going to have effects, and we are not immune to that.
For sure. It's an external event that we don't have control over. And that brings us to the topic of today's episode, which is all about the COVID crisis, which wreaked havoc across the world a few years back. Talk about how that hit and how it immediately affected WatchMojo when everything kind of shut down on that day in March.
Sure. Well, let's go back actually to December, because there were murmurs and you would read stuff and it was, you got a sense that, hey, this is maybe a bigger deal. Obviously, I'm not an expert on pandemics and all that. But then fast forward, in February, you'd take a business trip and people are talking about it. And I remember it was our then CFO. He was standing in my office and he just said, this was like early March, but he was like, no, he's like, we have to take this seriously. And he would talk about the direction of the wind, but all things that I was like, okay, again, like listening to others to come up to a conclusion. So March 12th, my birthday, woke up, saw news that schools were shut down. We had already started, like we knew that this was going to happen. So like we were, ideally, let's say we would have sent everybody home on let's say March 14th or 15th. But March 12th, when schools got shut down and it was like lockdown, we kind of flipped the switch and we're like, okay, everybody go home. Most of you are already ready. Thank God we had made investments in cloud. We had moved all of our network to the cloud and technically people could work. Again, we had to find shortcuts. But yeah, like we immediately, again, gratitude and perspective, we're like, look, it's easier for us to do this. So the team went home and basically it was clear that it wasn't going to be like a few days. And yeah, I mean, I won't lie. That was one moment when, like many, I thought it was like horrible and the world would end type of thing. It was kind of doomsday scenario. I felt we were like in communist era Yugoslavia. No hate there. I love all those countries now, Croatia, Bosnia, and all that. But I was like in the grocery store and I was like, they were letting 3 people in and it was like, you walk this way, you walk that way. It was like
bizarre.
It was a bizarre time. But what ended up happening was, basically half of the world, it was like Thanos snapped his finger and half of the world kind of got the impact right away. If you're in hospitality, if you're in, restaurants, travel, sports, a lot of things, like in Montreal, Just for Laughs and Cirque du Soleil had to shut down. Mm-hmm. They had to file for bankruptcy protection because you couldn't do shows. But we actually ended up benefiting because people were locked at home and home entertainment kind of shot up and people were watching more videos. And we benefited doubly. And at the time, I did actually have some guilt just as a decent human being because I was like, most people, we will get the tsunami wave eventually. And we did. Yeah. But at first, people were also not like producing shows for Hollywood. So they would just be kind of like watching WatchMojo top 10s and everything else on YouTube. So we ended up actually having, in 2020, a very good year. Obviously you could see slowdown because, travelers, travel advertisers were not advertising, Live Nation's not promoting shows, but right. Overall people still had to sell toilet paper and whatever and run ads. So we kind of, again, I was never complaining. I was just making sure the team was safe and sound and not losing their mind. And then, I would say we eventually were like, we eventually felt, I think, more of the ripple effects over time. But, it was just a crazy time.
We got a poll that just went up on your YouTube channel. So go check that out over on WatchMojo. We want to know, how did COVID ultimately affect you? Did it have positive changes in the end? Are you still recovering? Is everything back to normal? Or is it a completely new normal now? So go weigh in on that poll on our YouTube channel and we'll revisit those results at the end of the podcast. It's interesting because in March of 2020, I was preparing to sign a contract to start working for WatchMojo, and COVID kind of put the brakes on that. So what I ended up doing was freelancing for 4 months for WatchMojo, and ultimately ended up coming on full time later on in the summer in July. So it kind of impeded my process of entering the company, but didn't really ruin anything. Although it was a different environment when I did start working full time, because it was kind of like the transition to work from home was complete, and there was kind of no going back anymore. So.
Yeah, and the reason why I remember vividly, I was like, let us just transfer people home, and there's computer setups and there's some things that I was like, it was a bit unfair, I felt, to the team really managing the transition to add, like, here's another person who's never worked with us. And it's like culture and communication. We were able to kind of not miss a beat because we had 15 years of experience. We had culture, we had communication, we had kind of like social systems of, conduct and etiquette. But I do think it's hard. Like if any company, there's so many startups that started then, and without a doubt, timing matters. It's like if you start a business after 9/11, well, guess what? I think the person or people who were affected the most were pangolins. Their reputation changed for sure. They never had the same reputation after
They were blamed for everything.
They were blamed for everything.
Robert Alberton from Politico said that COVID has elements of fear that we felt after 9/11, the financial worry that we experienced in 2008, and the unknown that surrounds a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado all rolled into one thing. How much do you equate, COVID with something like 9/11? What was the impact globally? Do you think it's comparable?
Well, I think COVID really, because it was a true global thing, um, really was the first of its kind. Like I remember, again, I've always talked about the encyclopedias. I remember when I'd look at old hockey, like Stanley Cup champions, of which the Canadians are tops with 24. I remember like in 1917, the Stanley Cup was canceled because there was an outbreak of influenza in like the Seattle was supposed to host it, I think. Hello, Jorge. And so there was no, it stuck with me. And so I always remember that. And then apparently there was another pandemic in like the 50s, which nobody really talked about compared to the 1917 outbreak. And so this was really the first global thing. This really showed whether you're rich or poor, whether you're, Western or Eastern or whatever, it was really a crazy phenomenon. Look, 9/11 as a finance grad who lived in Montreal but was looking to work on Wall Street and all that, obviously was profound in the sense that it was a terrorist. When I say quotation marks, I'll explain it. It was definitely a terrorist attack. That's not my point, but it was a terrorist attack on American soil. It wasn't like Pearl Harbor. So I think to Americans it was a big deal. I also used to be like, hey, I could have been on a plane as a victim or like working on Wall Street as a victim. But I did understand, and I don't mean to be controversial at all. I did understand why a lot of people around the world were like, well, America goes around dropping bombs on other people. So this is the first time, okay, some sympathy, but let's calm down. But I just felt like, yeah, like in some ways, like we've been in World War III since 9/11. And I know everybody hates it when I say that. But if you think about it, from 9/11, we've slowly seen, like they never called World War I then. It was the Great War. So I kind of feel like that set off a chain of events there's a through line to Ukraine, Russia, Iran being where it is now is really a reflection of George Bush's another dumbass like Trump who took it to the next level. And I'm also not anti-Republican. I'm not anything. There's good parts of Bush, good parts of Trump, and many bad parts. But that was like the most disastrous thing that America could have ever done because it precipitated its fall in the sense that the average age of an empire is 250 years old. Next year, 2026 is America's 250-year anniversary. I do not think America is going anywhere. I think America could very well continue to have its best century looking ahead. Just look at market value of most of the top firms are American. That's where still you have all this innovation. But if we bring it all together, things like tariffs and things like a erratic president, like if I showed up every day, yeah, sometimes I'm fiery, but if every day there was chaos and every day I was like, today we're going here, tomorrow we're going there, you guys wouldn't be able to function. You'd be like, what the hell's happening, right? So imagine at Trump's level. So I feel like COVID really was the first global thing where whether you were like some villager in Pakistan or like living in Kenya or wherever, it affected you. Now, again, I hate the saying we're all in the same boat together. We're not. There was a lot of people who could go up to who lived in, let's say, New York City in their cramped apartment who had to work and couldn't go anywhere versus the executive who could go and work out of his Hampton residence for 4 months and nobody knew better, right? So even that wasn't that global in that sense. This is a bit different. I feel like the world does seem to be on the precipice of this massive thing. But we said that about Trump in the first term. And so we're saying it again. And I feel like even though, I find Germany in the 1920s, and I'm like a historian, 20th century and ancient times, as I've studied that more than most normal people would study any topic. Germany in the 1920s had a lot of similarities, and 1930s, to be fair, start off with the 20s, but mainly 1930s, has a lot of similarity with America now, whether it's inflation, whether it's an aging statesman, Hindenburg, Biden, making way for an erratic leader. But I don't like the Trump is Hitler talk. That's crazy.
Right.
But Germany,
and I don't think that as a global society, I don't think that we would, maybe this is just naivety on my part, but I don't think we would let another World War II type scenario happen at this stage.
Well, I think war would be very different. So a few years ago when I was at St. Petersburg, purely economic, nothing political, we talked, like there was one panel that talked about, at the time, it was still like AI is much more in the news, but we talked about machines. And I was basically saying how the real belligerents are no longer governments. If you think about it, even the US got out of space travel. It's a form of military, if you think about it. It's expansionism and all that. But if you think of corporations, Microsoft, Alphabet, Google, Facebook, Meta, Apple, all of them, they are cut across borders. They have soldiers across different state lines. They are the ones that are harnessing AI. You are absolutely going to have, look at drones. That's not even the future of war. That's the present.
Yeah.
Russia, Ukraine, when they study it, it'll be like, who had the most drones? Yes, Russia is an industrial mighty power and they have the population. Long term, they would destroy Ukraine just based on replenishing troops and all that. But it'll boil down to the drones.
I believe that just the conflict in and of itself caused huge innovation in drone technology.
Yeah, 1000%. Yeah, the same way that World War II led to a lot of advances, and all wars sadly do lead to. I mean, look, the reason why Germany and the Third Reich was so powerful is because the Germans were freaking brilliant scientists and inventors, and that's why Germany from 1850 till 1914 was the dominant thing. It had surpassed the UK, and it was in some ways the leading empire, so to speak. But yeah, no, so just to get back on track, it is possible, but I don't think wars will look like World War II and III. Yeah. I think it will be a combination of cyber warfare. It will be a lot of drones, but make no mistake about it, at some point your cops are going to be drones and cameras everywhere, and robots and dogs, and that's where we're headed. And all those will be developed by corporations who are effectively stateless. They're omnipresent, so to speak.
Yeah, so basically everything we've seen in Black Mirror up until this point.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Thanos snap that kind of erased half of most like profit, in many industries. How did it affect things outside of media? And I say that with the note that we had a travel channel, which kind of was affected, ultimately because of the travel industry was devastated, but our little travel channel wasn't able to, really be profitable during that time either. So
yeah, I mean, look, the reality is the reason why I made the call to pause Mojo Travels, which was really something that came to me when we were having strategic conversations with Time. Time had Time Magazine, People, Sports Illustrated, Fortune, but they also had Travel and Leisure. And they would be like, okay, could you take Time Magazine and Videofied? Could you take SI? I was like, hell yeah, we could do that. We already do content that would fit really well in video. But I was like, don't give me your bougie brand where everybody's going to be really, really protective. So they're like, we got Travel and Leisure. Like, that's easy to play with, right? So we didn't end up doing anything with Time, but that led to Mojo Travels, and that's why the name, like, I wanted a name like Escaper. I wanted a name that was really not Mojo related, actually. Yeah. But it was kind of as a placeholder, and we're like, okay, we'll just go with Mojo Travels. Now, during COVID, you could argue you could have done a really cool, like, fantasy, like, aspirational. Oh, I can't wait to go back to all these places when the lockdown ends. But I did kind of feel like word war, so to speak, and less is more, and adding complexity when the team is shifting to working from home seemed like a very bastardly, it's kind of like bad analogy, like Hitler opening a second front during World War II. Like, that's, when I've read so much about Hitler, I always think of that. Like, don't start a second front at the wrong time. So for us, Mojo Travels, given everything, we just made a concerted effort to double down on Watch Mojo, Miss Mojo. We kept plays because gaming was obviously still very much relevant. But if we're going to be honest, all of the trends that had already started that was benefiting YouTube and the Watch Mojos, but were like a rounding error in the grand scheme of things, were accelerated by COVID. So it wasn't like even the Thanos analogy where, okay, half the people just vanish and the other half have to figure out what's what. And I also did think that everybody else that was spared got hit afterwards one way or another. Either by, if you were Amazon, You had to probably invest a lot to meet demand at first, but then you're hungover. It's like anything else. Oh, you hired too many people. All the tech firms that overhired during COVID.
Yeah.
Then they had to let people go. So we also, again, it sounds like such a first-class problem, and I would never say it outside of this context, but like we grew a lot in 2020, and we had our best year in 21. So then when ZERP, the interest rate phenomenon, interest rates started to go up, and there was a retrenchment, nothing had changed in our business. We were probably always a straight line like this, but at that moment, we got the ricochet, the hangover effect. But all the trends really did just accelerate. Even you've heard me say that YouTube, why is YouTube, unlike Netflix, revolutionary? Because it changed what quality programming is. All of a sudden, the same way, like I could take a super important meeting on a Zoom call. Nobody's going to be like, you're lazy. Whereas before you have to put on the suit, get on the plane, go there, take the stupid cab, get there, realize you're at the wrong building, eventually meet, and you're like, what a pointless meeting, but I had to do this meeting. So similarly with content and storytelling, all of a sudden just doing Zoom-like Q&As was fine. Audiences really changed production values. Don't get me wrong, there was more of a hunger for like shiny stage productions and big productions, but it just accelerated everything. And it actually, frankly, I would say it moved up the demise of traditional media by like a good decade, if not more.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about, let's say, television is that I remember the late night television hosts transferring to working from home, filming from home, doing their live their tapings, or if it was a live show, and the quality just being absolutely terrible because they didn't know how to go about it, and they were just learning like all the rest of us. It was kind of hilarious to see.
Yeah, okay, you're right about the rest of us, but there is a fundamental difference that those folks were never programmed to work in that kind of bare bones. If you really think of it, if you're a comedian on stage and all you have is your mic, you really only have your word to make people laugh, right? But if you have props and if you have this, and so a lot of these late night shows, they're just made, it's just a big production, it's just a lot of smoke and mirrors. So when you actually took a Kimmel or a Fallon or all of those talented, entertainers, but you remove that whole production, it wasn't also their strength. They weren't like necessarily the best interviewers. Maybe some of them are great interviews. They weren't necessarily the funniest comedians, right? It was just that like they had this bag of skills that really lend itself well to that kind of like, hey folks, how are you? And without that, it wasn't the same thing, right? And then at the same time, you still had a lot of YouTubers doing what they were doing. And so the society kind of shifted faster.
Yeah. COVID was also a reset in a lot of ways. And like it changed the way that we work in terms of working from home, which we're still doing now. It's become the norm and it's more efficient in a lot of ways. There are drawbacks. I miss seeing you guys more often in person, but there's also added efficiencies. Like you said, being on Zoom, you don't have to get on the plane to go to that meeting. And we do this every single day. So we're not spending 2 hours a day in traffic like we used to. So there's definitely benefits, but in what other ways was it a reset?
Well, look, I think what you're seeing today is companies that are companies, yeah, but people, leaders and managers who are intellectually honest and, don't pee on your leg and say it's raining. They would probably act a different way if they didn't have like massive real estate leases that they signed for 10 years. And all of a sudden, you also had an entire organizational makeup that did have that kind of mid-level manager walking the floor, kind of who's doing what, who's not back from lunch. Oh, look, it's 4:30. They're not here. So I personally feel like it removed a lot of like the noise, the filler, the song and dance that is really just bullshit. It doesn't really add value. It's like old school power dynamics and stuff like that. And in some ways, if you are at the office 9 to 5, you're not actually an assassin or disciplined with your time because you're on company dime.
Mm-hmm.
These are human psychology things. I'm not even talking about WatchMojo. Just when you're at the office, you might take a bit longer to go to grab a lunch. Oh, the bathroom break. Now you have your phone. You're lost for 40 minutes. You go to get coffee. You take the scenic route. So you're not necessarily even all that productive. Now, the only thing that applied to us is a lot of our team members need quiet. When I visited Vice, Shane Smith was taking me and he was like opening these closets. I was like, Shane, what the fuck do people do in here? And then he was like, this is where they edit. They need quiet. I was like, yeah, that actually makes sense. Because I used to come in and be like, hey, guys, this happened. We should do this video. And people were like, shut up. I'm working. I'm editing. But we did have a lot of time wasted. And sometimes I was like, it feels like a high school cafeteria type of thing. And that's part of it. That's part of culture and societies and subgroups. But now I feel, one, I'll be fair, the team earned it. Yeah, there were some slackers, some people that never fit. But those are exceptions. I can't say all these idiots. No, you guys crushed it. You all worked really well. You all stayed perfect. Now, the team gets credit for having a culture. I've always said, don't be rude to people. So we kind of had this culture already where you knew that if you're working on step 3, you have to give it to Tom for step 4. You would continue that just because you're on a Zoom or Hangout or GChat. Right. But if you always had this kind of toxic culture where you're like, that's Johnson's problem, screw him. Well, it would just get amplified now that you're working remote, right? So for me, and I know it was always whenever we'd bring up work from home, I felt people just assume like, oh, the boss, the employer, he wants us back. I was like, I don't want to see you. I miss you all, but we don't need to be here, So very long story short, I think the best companies are those that find that middle ground. But I also think any company where they're not doing the kind of work we do, whether it's sales or creative or innovation or certain things, I don't think if working from home is the way to go. Yes, you are more efficient with your time, but you get into this routine and you actually drive yourself further into obsolescence and irrelevance faster. There is this element of being with your fellow soldiers in a common area. It just makes you understand what's what. There are some distractions, there is some waste, but the net is more positive. And I do feel that that is also happening where some leaders don't have the courage and confidence to say, hey, man, I understand we've done this for the last few years, but it's time to go back. And this is why I just feel, again, so grateful. I personally do believe that. I'm very constant. I think the best organizations are in office. Mm-hmm. We have a very unique workflow and tasks where for us, it makes a ton of sense to actually largely let people work from home. And my definition of hybrid is not the bullshit like Monday, Tuesdays, because that's just disruptive. It's more for meetings. For some meetings, we should be in the office for those who are physically in the same town. But for the rest, I'm sure you're more efficient because you're on your time. You might take a break as you're uploading something. You're going to go press the laundry, but it has less stress on you because you got your fucking shorts cleaned. You know what I mean? So I see it very like big picture like that. But I feel like what's happening now is two negatives. Those that should be in the office will not be. It's going to harm competitiveness. And then there's a lot of companies that don't need to be in an office that are forcing people back because they got like leases. And that's also not going to be constructive.
Yeah. And in our case, we hired outside of our country, even in many instances, for people who are international. So there's no possibility of them coming to work in the office. But
are you lobbying now for? No, I agree. But look, we always had a pretty remote, like pre-COVID, like it was a bit more than you would think because we also had international channels, right? But absolutely, even the core team on WatchMojo English or Miss Mojo, like a few people even producing the show. Yvonne is in Mexico. This morning I was in a meeting for Miss Mojo. Tyler, he's based in Brooklyn. Our other colleague, Tori, who manages a lot of the writers, she's also in New York, and we have people all over, I also, not to be a bitch about this, I also think we don't really take advantage of our global team. Like even like when stories break, we're super quick. It's incredible. Like I'm always like in awe on Twitter, like fanboying going, oh, I can't believe how amazing we are. But I sometimes go, given what an amazing global team we have, I'm like, we could be running a 247 like news operation almost.
And with all the time zones that we're operating.
With all the time zones, and like you go to bed, you finish your task, you pass the puck to the next guy. But again, I don't complain because overall everybody does a great job. And
well, something interesting to consider moving forward.
Yep.
Tell me about the effect on the ad market. I know we had mentioned that there was a bump in viewership because people were home. They didn't have much to do. They were watching YouTube. And so that was a great time. But then reality kind of set in after.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is advertising, in this case, in economic lingo, I'm sure we could ask Professor Trump. I'm sure he studied this a lot. It's more of like there's trailing indicators and leading indicators type of thing. So obviously advertising was like a trailing. It took a bit of while. Like obviously company at first are like business as usual. We're going to be confident in the storm. And then day two, they show their true colors. They're like, panic, shut down, go home. And eventually when they scale back, they do lay off people. And I think it's in that context that it's almost unconscionable not to also reduce marketing. You know, it's very bad to lay people off. It affects people. It affects families. You don't want to do that ever. You know, I personally have had a hard time letting people go. I've gone a bit better. And we've never had, knock on wood, like layoffs of that kind. But eventually, yeah, if Google lays off 10,000 people and they don't even know what the fuck these people were doing to begin with, it's hard for them to be like, yeah, we're still sponsoring and spending all this money. So you start to see a reduction in ad spend. And we are like a great proxy for, you know, we have all this different kind of content across all these different videos. So, you know, we don't get hit as much. But when there's like air coming out of a bag, there's just less, you know, fill. But yeah, what ended up happening is TV was on a collision course with the internet. And then 2020 just was the tipping point where the internet took over. Mm-hmm. And then, frankly, I don't think TV will ever recover. For a long time, people were like, well, TV is not like print or radio. It will be different because of news, because of sports. But what ended up happening is there was no sports. So a lot of companies could actually take the opportunity to kind of be like, how valuable is sports? How important is sports programming? And the answer is a lot. But what happened? The leading platforms, Amazon Prime, Google, others stepped up to buy those rights away from traditional. And so it really, 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 as I said, it's just accelerated every trend. And that's why now the internet has far surpassed TV. And, you know, I think, frankly, the internet is TV now. Like YouTube, like the combination of YouTube, but even like Reddit, you know, that kind of like news happens. I'll go to X. I'll go to X to real time. It's a real time search engine, even though the search engine sucks. Ask Elon. My God. But ultimately, I don't turn on the news. There's no point. You're not going to find out what happens, but right away you find out what happens online. So I would say that, I guess, COVID's long-term eventual impact was making the internet become what TV was.
We got poll results in for the poll that we put up on our YouTube channel. How did COVID change the world for you? It was actually, you know, fairly even split. 38% said that they're everything is back to normal. 27% said they're still recovering. 19% said it's a completely new normal, and ultimately 13% said it ultimately created a positive change. So positivity is in the minority. Most people say that things are back to normal, and you know.
How about you? What did it do for you?
Well, I think ultimately it was a positive change because I really enjoy working from home. I get to spend a lot more time with my kids than I would have if I was still working in an office. So I think the positives far outweigh the benefits of the negatives as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, my daughters are 17 soon and 14, and I think even my teammates, like my colleagues, you guys are surprised how much I tell you guys to spend time with your kids when they're young. Like, I was very lucky. I worked like a madman, but I was always there driving them, picking them up from school, dinner most nights at home. And like, so it was like, I can't complain. And I love those moments. So I'm like, I tell everybody, I'm like, do that. And I do think COVID makes it easy because I'm like, you also had all day to, you know, do work and turn on the dishwasher. And, you know, earlier again, I had a meeting and I was like, I have a podcast in an hour. I need to fix this situation in the kitchen. And it's, you know, it's just, it's doesn't affect my work. I was still, so it's just a big game changer. I will say this when I look at that. I do feel though that there was this like lost generation factor of people that probably did not recover. And I hear from a lot of CEOs, like when I was in, well, I don't want to say the city because it'll be pretty odd, but I was in a place, it wasn't like in New York. I was in some other city.
Okay.
And the CEO was just mentioning it. And, you know, I got to meet him and we'd gone to dinners a few times. So it wasn't weird for him to say this, but he's like, He's like, I went through a big depression because he was like, I was used to coming into the office every day. And he apparently went to the office every day during COVID anyway. And he was like, I just feel like I lost my anchor. He's like, I didn't know this. He goes, I always thought like, oh, I have my hobbies, I have my wife, my kids or whatever. But he was like, my anchor was this work.
Mm-hmm.
He was like coming in and being the boss and this and that. And I kind of like was like, I do get that, because I also had to find like the glass half full. Took me a while, because I was somebody that I consider myself aloof. I consider myself introverted to some extent, although I know that I'm not introverted, but I do like that solitude by choice. But what ended up happening is you had this solitude by force, by necessity. And yeah, like you don't talk, like it's weird. Like when you start off, you talk to everybody, you're very busy. And then in the end, you have a team, everybody's in their own little bubble. And so when the gentleman was speaking to me, when I would meet other CEOs after, well, not necessarily CEOs, but anybody that like managed a team that was really like had a great team, and they didn't necessarily have specific tasks. It was managing processes and teams and all that. That became a big refrain, that it was like people who were like for all purposes, intents and purposes, super successful, but internally they were just like, my life is upside down and I have to, cope or whatever. But I do also think that there are some people that just like left workforces and their lives were changed, and they fell off the grid. But so I'm guess I'm not surprised by the results.
Yep, same here. There was a situation between WatchMojo and Just for Laughs around this time also. Do you want to touch on that before we wrap it up?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was, to be honest with you, before. It was in 2017, we were approached by ICM to join them in their bid to acquire Just for Laughs. And this is a video that Rebecca and I did 6 years ago. And we were, in the end, not part of the consortium that got them, which made sense. Montreal Canadiens bought them. They owned Jazz Festival and Evenco. So that made sense. And then the Montreal Canadiens brought in Bell Media, who are their partner. So it made a ton of sense. But during COVID, Just for Laughs took a hit. Cirque du Soleil outright just filed for bankruptcy. And, as much as I'm like a pragmatic business person and I say, you don't want things to get to you, they do get to you. I mean, it wasn't personal, but I was a bit bummed that we couldn't buy this amazing institution that was one of the beacons of WatchMojo, the way I used to say, like, we're the latest media and entertainment export out of Montreal, following in the footsteps of Cirque du Soleil, Just for Laughs, etc. But I won't lie, if we would have bought them, it could have been fatal for WatchMojo, because revenue stopped coming in. You still have all these employees. I personally would have hated to let people go, but that is the right decision. So, but it would have been a disaster for WatchMojo. But yeah, no, so it was like another lesson that everything happens for a reason, even if it's a painful lesson and it takes you a long time to realize why. But it was like we dodged a bullet. But
yeah, I was going to ask, in hindsight, do you feel fortunate that it didn't pan out the way that you were hoping initially?
I'm such a crazy masochist. I still would have liked. I feel like WatchMojo and Just for Laughs, the combination of like comedy, entertainment, digital media plus events, I do feel like that could have been interesting, but I also don't care. Like, it's in the past and it wasn't meant to be. But I do feel like, not that, I mean, look, it was, let's also be clear. ICM, talent agency, since acquired by CAA, possibly partly because of the Just for Laughs, I just realized like they needed to join something bigger, because that was obviously a financial hit. The Montreal Canadiens and Bell Media couldn't get it to where. So I've also learned I'm just a mere, servant of whomever. I'm not that special. But I was very, very bullish and confident that I could take that and really grow it. And, managing people, like pushing people and not pretending like I knew what to do in running a festival. And as you know, we could have totally taken the SNL Lorne Michaels route earlier on instead of doing top 10s factual. We were doing sketch comedy, right? Yeah. So the goal was to build Just for Laughs, not into SNL or Mad TV, but in that footstep, like that would what it would look like in the 21st century. But it wasn't meant to be. It's all good.
It's interesting to think about what may have been, though. Definitely. But fortunately, WatchMojo is still around.
Here's the thing that I realized. we could do that tomorrow. You don't actually need Just for Laughs to do what I wanted to do with it,
Right.
because it's really just a stage. It's a stage where even if they pay Chris Hart or Chris Rock gazillions to come and perform, Chris Rock retains that footage, the rights. He may want to go sell it to Netflix. So it's not like there was any IP or anything. It was really, I don't mind admitting it, a lot of pride that, hey, this is a fantastic asset. And, you know, you have to learn to manage your pride to avoid fatal mistakes, as that surely could have been.
Absolutely. Next week, speaking of pride, we're talking about being a made man in entrepreneurship. Do you want to give a little preview of what is to come on the next episode?
Sure. I mean, the concept is not that crazy. It's just that, like, historically, entrepreneurs were not people that even knew what entrepreneurship was, like the Richard Bransons or whatever. They're ultimately sellers, marketers, people who walk to the beat of their own drum and would start things that would become businesses, and they would eventually get to a cash flow positive situation. And even if they used debt to expand, it was kind of like a very different thing. They were just cash flow positive, you know. It was like that was how they made their fortune, so to speak. Unfortunately, in the last 15, 20 years, with the explosion of venture capital, which has brought some good things, it's also brought a lot of bad things. One of them was this bullshit around like funding. You know, it's like you would get an article written about you in the Wall Street Journal or back in the day TechCrunch if you raised money, but if you were a profitable business, it was like boring. So in our industry, the made man isn't raising money, but it's, you got to do a deal. You do have to either get some third party, whether it's an investor or a strategic buyer, that comes and, you know, sniffs around, kicks the tires, and gives you a bit of validation. Mm-hmm. And so as an entrepreneur, in 2015 or 16, when like Ernst & Young was like, do you want to enter the entrepreneurship of the year? I was like, absolument pas. So not like, yes, I know I'm out there, but I'm actually not seeking the limelight in that sense. So I was like, no, it's fine. But then I was like, you know what? It's not bad if a big accounting firm comes and vets us. If we do win, it's a source of pride for the team, but it's also shows that, okay, this isn't a fugazi. It's like a real business. So similarly, as the 2010s went by and we were more and more successful, I won't lie, I had this thing in the back of my mind that I was like, you know what? Being independent, even if you're profitable, doesn't really give you that kind of thing on your resume if you care about it. Mm-hmm. That these days, an entrepreneur, it's if you sell your business or somebody comes as an outsider and validates it. So we'll talk a little bit about that, the good, bad, and ugly of that next week.
Cool. Should be an interesting one. Thank you for your time as usual, Ash. Always great to speak with you.
Likewise.
Thank you to all the viewers, and we'll see you again next week. Same time, same place.
Cheers. 90 days.